Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Keith McCammon. I'll be the moderator today for our webcast, which is titled Break Through the Noise, How to Take Control of Your Incident Response Operations. We're going to have an hour-long format. We've got about 45 minutes of content today. We've got four panelists who we'll introduce in just a moment. We'll have plenty of time. We should have plenty of time to take questions at the end. However, I would encourage everyone to submit questions via the chat window or via the webinar chat window. We'll be taking those throughout, and we'll try to get to as many of those during the course of the conversation as we can. The more interactive we make this, the better it should be for everybody. So again, my name is Keith McCammon, Chief Security Officer here at Red Canary. Webinar is not about me, so I'm going to move right on. We'll talk some about our panelists. I'd like to introduce everyone. We'll start with Michael Haig. So Michael heads up Advanced Threat Detection here at Red Canary. Mike, if you'd like to go ahead and say a few words.
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Haig. As Keith mentioned, I'm the Director of Advanced Threat Detection for Red Canary. I lead the continuous efforts to enhance our detection capabilities. Previously, I worked for a large defense contractor, and more recently, building and leading the security program at Danaher. I have about 10 years in security. I specialize in incident response and threat detection.
Fantastic. Next, we've got one more fellow Red Canary. So we've got Joe Moles, who heads our detection operations team. And Joe, if you'd like to say hi.
Hey, Joe Moles. Yep, like Keith mentioned, I lead the detection operations team here at Red Canary. Prior to that, I led the engineering team for Office Max Corporate, and been in security for about 12 to 14 years. So.
Fantastic. Thank you, Joe. Next, we have Tim Collier. So Tim is an information security manager with Motorola Solutions. And Tim, let you say hi and anything else you'd like to about yourself.
Hi there, everyone. So yes, my name is Tim Collier. I work for Motorola Solutions, and I manage our cyber defense team here. Prior to that, I was working with Joe at Office Max, actually, by coincidence. And before that, I came into information security from the professional mariner industry teaching sail training. So actually, I thought we were going to be covering celestial navigation today, but I guess we're talking about security. So I'll try and change gears.
Hey, we'll still have plenty of time for questions throughout. So if we get any questions that are in your wheelhouse, we'll be sure to send them your way. Thanks, Tim. And last but certainly not least, we have Bob Argenbright, who's a security engineer with Heroku. And Bob, same, if you'd like to say a few words.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, so as Keith said, I'm a engineer on the security team at Heroku. I mainly focus on threat detection, incident response, and also security operations. I've previously worked at a couple Fortune 500 companies doing security, as well as a defense contractor, and most of my experience has been varied through incident response, threat analysis. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. So for those of you on the phone and on the webinar, so fantastic panel. These are all folks I've known for a long time. They've all known one another or worked with one another to various degrees. So hoping to have a really good dialogue throughout. And again, that only gets better the more questions that we get from the participants and from the audience. So with that said, we'll dive right in. Going to hit a really brief overview of our objectives for the webinar. But again, this is a discussion, right? And so hopefully we'll take this, in any number of directions based on how questions and flow of conversation go. So the goal here at a really high level is to, help you understand how to kind of get your heads wrapped around incident response. And this, hopefully will apply to organizations that, have an incident response program in place and are, looking to take that to the next level or looking to mature that a little bit. But it'll also be really useful, I think, for organizations who have no security or incident response capability and are looking to build one. we're going to talk about what we think are a few of the really high level, kind of a few of the pillars of a good incident response program. And certainly the ones that are probably most important if you're trying to improve your, improve your effectiveness, and overall, improve your security posture. We'll talk about prioritizing alerts across the tool set. We're going to talk about systems for tuning and handling alert quality. We'll talk a little bit about metrics and a whole bunch of things in between, right? Incident response is probably, one of the most demanding and nuanced disciplines within information security, and so there's a lot to cover. We're not going to cover, all aspects of incident response today. We don't have nearly enough time, but again, hopefully we'll hit some pieces that'll convey a lot of value. So to set the stage for what we're going to talk about today, we've got the incident response operations framework that we've laid out here. This is very, very simplified, right? And again, we've really done that so that we can hit a few really critical components in a relatively short amount of time. We've got detection, triage and response, and feedback. A lot goes into those. You can see triage and response is probably the heaviest part, and that's where we'll spend the most time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Haig. So Mike, you've got a lot of experience doing incident response in environments of different sizes and different complexities. Also, doing incident response, for a single employer, but also working in service provider environments where you're responding for lots of folks. So, if you would, can you just start by walking us through this, and then we'll dive right into tooling.
Yeah, absolutely. So everything we would do is based off of a detected event, and so an alert would trigger, we would go and respond, and that part is the triage response process, and that's where we're collecting as much information about the event, gathering the scope of it, trying to work to validate what this is and where it came from. And obviously, like you mentioned, this is a super high-level overview of the whole incident response process. But the feedback, the lessons learned to a lot of what we do with incident response plays into how we handle that threat again next time. Was it a unknown? Was it a detection that occurred that we had no proper detection for last time? So moving forward, we take that feedback from this current detection, put it right back into it so that we could detect it again next time, or build ways around so that we can continuously detect it moving forward. Anything wrapped around that type of event. But overall, it's an incident response framework. It takes time. It's not something that is tossed together within 20 minutes and you have a proper flow through everything. But it's definitely a large cycle. It takes time. It's definitely an organizational effort.
Fantastic. So I think one of the first things you mentioned, and almost in passing, because I know we're going to spend a lot of time on triage and response, but these threads that you have to pull have to come from somewhere, right? Pretty much all the time that those are going to come from tools of some sort. Now, in some cases, those are tools that you have in-house, and in some cases, those are tools provided or managed by a vendor. So maybe we'll dive right in. Talk a little bit about tools, and how you've handled that, and kind of your approach to choosing them, wrangling them, and so on and so forth.
That's a great pick. So yeah, we all have tools within our organizations, and each one is generating an amount of alerts. And so what I found that worked for us in the past when we were working on bringing everything together, so in like a log management solution, we actually got to the place where we were just getting inundated with alerts. So we built out a impact matrix, and based on the impact matrix, we took the tool or whatever the amounts of data was from it, and we would kind of begin to build a process around making it easier for each product. But it still took time because we had to go product by product and build out something for each one. So we were looking at use cases, for instance. We wanted to build out use cases for that specific product. It takes us time, right? Now you got to stop everything. Your alerts are building up. Things are still breaking and going down. but now you're focusing on, let's say, Windows event logs, and you're looking to tune that and make it more operationalized for you and properly detect things.
That's great. I know one of the things that we talk a lot about internally is kind of managing bandwidth during all aspects of detection through response, right? And you run into environments. There are some environments where they have very few tools, right? But they're very, very good at them. They understand them well, and the tools provide a lot of insights. In other environments, you have a significant number of tools, and you run into you see teams that have all the money in the world and have all the tools in the world, but they're not really good at any of them, right? They're not very effective. They don't have a lot of depth. Tim actually say, if you'd like to weigh in, how do you handle, as someone running an organization that's got, a ton of reach in terms of, endpoint businesses, things like that under management, and also a lot of data sources flowing in. How do you approach that, and how do you manage and measure effectiveness of those tools, right up front?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, especially for an organization that you're not just starting out where let's go hire 20,000 people and start a company. So the organization has been around for a while, so you have old tools in place and a changing threat landscape and new gaps and new visibility that you need and all the rest of it. So for us, it's a constant juggle of evaluating what we have already that was put into place some time ago, maybe with different personnel and different expertise, and trying to figure out if it still meets our need or whether we need to replace it with something the new generation of equivalent or something totally different, or just drop it altogether. I think another important discussion around tools comes into play in terms of effectiveness is who creates the tool, by which I mean vendor or homegrown, and that Motorola is a larger organization, so we do have the capability to build our own tools from time to time, and it's always an interesting challenge as to whether that's the right choice or not. You get strengths with purchased tools and strengths with homegrown tools, and so we're constantly trying to answer that question on a case-by-case basis. That in my opinion, the homegrown tool concept is great for flexibility and customization. It's going to fit your environment, but the challenge is that there's a person or a team of people that know that, and then inevitably people move on, and so how do you maintain that tool when the founder has left? And that's where it's nice to have a vendor who offers a support structure. And also there's the time trade-off. You can pay somebody to provide you a tool, or you can spend the time to build it yourself.
Yeah, that's cool. That could almost be another webinar entirely, right? Just a pretty classic build versus buy decision, right? Where, as you mentioned, right, building something is kind of the ultimate in flexibility, right? You can make the thing do whatever you want, but the downside is that you have to take the time to make the thing do what you want. Whereas buyers tend to prioritize things like predictability and cost, right? So no, it's cool. I appreciate the insights. So we're going to talk a lot about tools throughout this, so we're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time here. I think at this point, we'll shift forward. We'll kind of talk about triage and response, and you can see the way that we've kind of laid this out. You've got these four key components of triage and response, right? You've got prioritization, so your alerts come in. How do you choose what you're going to look at first, right? You have assignment, so once you've figured out how to prioritize, all of those inbound things in some way, who's going to work on what? Then eventually you have to go investigate, right? So you got to pull those threads. You have to determine whether they're false positive or confirmed threats, and then you've got to jump into remediation. So we'll take each of these in chunks. Again, any questions that come up throughout, we'll try to dig in and take them, as they're relevant. So first thing we'll talk about is prioritization, right? So we just got done talking about tools, right? And remember here that tools aren't all security products that you go out and buy, right? Your system's generating log files. Your system logs are the product of a tool. There's a lot of data coming in from a lot of places, and just the simple exercise of figuring out, of these 100 things that are coming in to a team of, maybe a few people with relatively limited bandwidth, how do you choose what to do and when? So, Bob, if you don't mind giving us your perspective on this, so how do you deal with this? If you could give us kind of a really high-level overview of the types of tools you use, the volume that you see, and how you deal with determining of all these alerts, like what you're going to pull off first, and then go run to ground.
Sure. So, as we were just talking about with tools, we've got so many options with data coming in, where data sources are coming from, what vendors, how they're being used, and that all plays into not only just what we're seeing, but also our workflow and how we go ahead and prioritize. And it often goes between a few different categories, such as critical systems, which systems are going to be a high severity no matter what. When you have state changes on a server that is fairly static in its behavior, that should instantly be a high severity alert, just because of the context around what that server is supposed to be doing. So a lot of it is context around critical systems, critical services, and also things like alert context and the knowledge about the threat itself. For instance, we have threat intelligence telling us certain things are bad. Alerts come in where it says oh, command and control is detected from system A to system B, but you've never seen that threat before. Is that going to instantly be a high severity alert, or does that require further triage? In my experience, the better approach has always been to start with a minimal amount of detection and be able to prioritize that small subset. Make sure you actually know what those alerts mean and what the threats are that those alerts are alerting on, and then build from there. Once you turn on that fire hose of just putting in a vendor's product and turning on all the rules, it's going to take a long time to dig out of that pile of alerts. So a lot of it is just simply knowing your environment as well as what these alerts actually mean.
So you said a really interesting thing there, right up front, which was, you talked about where the alerts came from, right? And that's, I think that's actually, that's a really interesting aspect of prioritization that a lot of people overlook, right? It's the easy thing for people to do, and particularly a team that's just getting started, right? The natural thing to do is to buy some tools. They're going to generate alerts, and then those alerts are going to have a severity, right? So your source fire system is going to tell you this thing is like low, medium, critical, right? And that's the really natural tendency, is to just kind of take the severities that come from your tools, and you use those to determine the order in which you're going to look at things. But there's that really interesting twist, which is that we're not actually protecting computers, right? I'm not protecting my laptop from attackers. I'm protecting data and information that my laptop and that I have access to, right? So Mike, I know you've worked a lot with this, right? In environments where you've got a tremendous amount of attack surface, a tremendous number of systems. Can you talk a little bit about how you've kind of bucketed systems, users, data, and things like that, and the kind of strategies that you can use to do what Bob just described, which is to really neck it down to a manageable level and just make sure that your methodology and your prioritization is sound before you kind of open the aperture.
Yeah, this is tricky because if you being we did have a large amount of attack surface, the focus was you had to kind of prioritize based on the information that was stored on, say, let's start with a server. Servers would take a higher priority based on a SharePoint box, domain controller, whether we knew what was on that SharePoint server or not, it was still housing information. And it could have been intellectual property, it could just be day-to-day work activity that's being checked in and checked out by a R&D team. But that information alone is worth something to somebody else. Or it's information that's critical to the business, where if it were to get encrypted with ransomware, it would be critical. So a lot of the times we didn't know going into our business units whether they had 500 servers or 5 servers, but we always went into it thinking that those would be the most important things, and then we would kind of back out to either profiling based on user activity. So if it was like a CEO or the executive management team, we knew that they would take a higher priority versus kind of like a workstation that's being used by 20 people in a shared box. So we kind of looked at it based on that, and based on the fidelity of the alerts coming from servers, those would trickle to the top quicker versus kind of a general workstation. That's kind of how we had to deal with it.
Gotcha. Yeah, and so there's a couple of interesting, kind of, I'll call them buzzwords, right? But a lot of times when we're dealing with this and even helping customers to understand it and prioritize things, we talk about high value assets, and we talk about high risk assets, right? Where high value, obviously, that's your secret sauce, right? The thing that the company's intellectual property, companies that make things or produce things, programming for those tools, formulas for pharmaceuticals, all those types of things are kind of what we refer to as high value. And then you've got high risk. High risk we'll usually use to bucket users and things like that, right? It can also be systems that have a lot of exposure. But yeah, as you mentioned, right, your high risk users are going to be, folks with access to sensitive information or folks with access to a lot of information, right? Which is your executives, your board, but also administrative staff, right? People who are people who are directly subordinate to folks who have access to a lot of sensitive information. So that weaving all those things into prioritization seems like a lot, but if you take the time to do that up front, I think you're much better prepared to kind of to deal with the later stages.
I think there's one other thing, if I can jump in, that is worth considering in the prioritization step. We've talked about data and systems and sources of data, et cetera, but I think that your personnel who are looking at it is also an element that dictates how you are able to prioritize things. When it maybe shows my age, but when we talk triage, I always think of the show MASH, and so they're always out there triaging patients coming in on the helicopters and things like that. And when you are working with a team of people, or you're just the lone guy, it makes a difference about what you're able to prioritize. So you're the field medic out there with only so many tools available, so you're going to prioritize the super serious stuff, and a fully staffed hospital with specialists and things like that will dictate kind of different levels of priorities. It's just another layer that has to be on top of the technology aspect of priorities that I think is worth considering. You need to understand the maturity of your organization from a security perspective, and it'll help drive where you're going to direct your resources, because there's always an opportunity cost.
Yeah, that's awesome. You're absolutely right, and that's a perfect segue into assignment, right? Because that's exactly what we're moving into the next phase now, where you've got an alert, you've done some manner of prioritization, but now you've got to make that final decision to say, all right, where is it going to go, right? Um, and so, yeah, if you want to take this, Tim, it'd actually be interesting to hear how you deal with this, and we'll definitely, I think we'll go all the way around with this one because this is one of those things that I've seen done both ways, right? Where you've got siloed assignment versus flat assignment. And Tim, if you want to, if you don't mind, just follow your line of thought there all the way through. And so now let's assume that you have who you have, and you've got these systems coming in. Which approach do you guys take when you're looking at just like this simple siloed versus flat model? And is there anything else in there that you consider?
Yeah, and so yes, I guess it is a good segue because again, I think that it depends upon the size of your response team and therefore most likely the size of your organization in terms of how you're going to be able to assign things so that field medic is going to, doesn't matter whether he's a heart surgeon or not, if somebody's got a problem there, you got to deal with it. Whereas if you have a larger organization, you have the resources available to have somebody to dedicate to looking at IDS alerts. That's awesome, So I think that's a big driver in how things get assigned is just flat out team size and therefore, availability to have specialization. We also have, rather than siloed versus flat in terms of the source of alerts, we also have some kind of differences of assignment in terms of the nature of the attack, whether it is, or the incident, whether it is commodity malware, kind of generic, run-of-the-mill, doesn't care where it lands as long as it can infect something and do its work, or more targeted. So we have different teams that get engaged depending on how that breaks down. And so an incident might start out with the general, first level analyst kind of thing, and then realize, oh, this might be actually targeted, and so that gets bumped over to somebody else to deal with it.
Great. Yeah, thank you. We actually just had a couple questions come in that are kind of directly relevant to what we just talked about in terms of prioritization, but also are also relevant to what we're discussing here. And so I'll pose the questions, and Bob, if you don't mind, I'd like to get your thoughts and then Mike's on both of these. So one of the questions is, do you feel that you need a SIM to successfully prioritize alerts within your tooling? And the other is, how do you balance, are you taking these severities in, and do you do any assignment based on severity, right? Which is kind of part of what you just described, Tim. So, Bob, in your environment, if you notice here in this diagram, I'll call out the fact that the SIM's just standing there in line with all these other tools, right? And so, in a typical environment, mechanically, you're going to have firewall, IDS, EDR flowing into a SIM. Sometimes it's going to be one for one, right? Sometimes if your EDR system generates an alert, your SIM just passes that thing through. Other times your SIM is taking, snapping a bunch of different conditions together based on rules you've set up, and it's generating new alerts of its own based on this context. Bob, could you kind of just explain, from a tooling and architecture standpoint, how how you guys have laid that out, and then how you deal with assignment and matrixing? And also, I think just if you could also speak to the size of the team you're on and the teams that you've worked on, I think that might be interesting.
Sure. So I'll go ahead and start with team size because that it does really drive how we approach things. Just like Tim said. So for instance, when I was at Danaher, it was 2 guys. We had very heavy reliance on our machines working efficiently and effectively because we just didn't have cycles for them to not work efficiently. on my current team, we have a bit more cycles than that. We're a team of about 4. So we have a little bit more cycles, but we also have, a lot of different kind of interrupts that grab our attention. So switching gears over to the SIM question, is it a requirement? I would say depends on the amount of data that you're handling and what that data means to you. If you're in an environment where you have, even 1,000+ endpoints, counting servers and workstations, that is going to be most likely too much data to handle just by looking at a few different systems, such as firewall, IDS, because there's just too much data coming in to be able to check all of those windows in a timely manner or to review the reports coming from those devices, whereas a SIM can actually take in and prioritize those for you if configured correctly. And I think I want to hone in on that a little bit because not most, but many SIM deployments I've seen are not being used effectively. And I think that just simply comes from a lack of resources to be able to drive that SIM development correctly. It takes a lot to be able to have all of your data sources in the right place, understand all the data that you're looking at, and be able to create meaningful alerts from that product. So I think one big thing that has helped prioritization and assignment in my experience is just being able to categorize your data in a way that makes sense, being able to apply resources to the SIM or the devices themselves, where a resource is able to constantly be tuning and adjusting those products to make them effective. Because I feel in this day and age where technology is kind of becoming more open and responsive to the customer's needs, that also requires a bit more customization on our part as consumers. Nobody has an identical network. Nobody has identical people and processes. And so we're always going to need to adapt these tools not only to tell us what we want, but also to be effectively used in our workflow and with the amount of resources that we have. So as we kind of look at where we're assigning things, like with my current team, it's generally more of a flat model, but it's also kind of a hybrid model where we start out as a flat model. Everybody's kind of looking at all the things, and then we prioritize from that because people tend to have different strengths in knowledge and skill level. So we tend to toss things to others as appropriate.
Fantastic. Yeah. One of the when you mentioned the hybrid model, right? And we see this a lot is that you first of all, I mean one common theme here is that we've got 4 smiley faces there on the security team, right, dealing with all these inbound alerts, and I think that well over half of our customers would be really happy to have half that number of smiling faces, right? So so the reality of it is that you mentioned it, and so did Tim. I mean, all of this is very theoretical, until you have more than a one-person team, right? But even in larger teams, it's kind of interesting to see how that works out because it usually always does end up being some sort of hybrid where the actual alerts and investigation, which we'll talk about in a second, end up being flat, right? In the sense that everything comes into one place and everyone has equal opportunity to pull the next investigation off the stack and run it to ground. But a lot of times, what at least what I've seen in my experience, and I know I'm sure Michael will chime in too, is that while you've got that team dealing with all of the outputs from that system, you still end up having a person who is, who specializes in the EDR platform or who specializes on the network side of things, right? And so you end up with this kind of hybrid where, um, yes, everyone's working on everything kind of in like this full matrix, but if it ends up being an EDR heavy investigation, right, and that's where most of the information or context is derived, that ends up kind of very naturally flowing over to those folks. And I think that's the way that probably most effective operations teams work. And I think, again, we've kind of hit a good segue there into investigation, because I think, we've talked about assignment and those different models. So we'll jump over here and talk a little bit about investigation, right, and what that means. Again, this means very different things to different people, right? So, Mike, let's have, if you don't mind, why don't you go ahead and get started and kind of, talk us through, your take on investigation. What stages, at a high level are important to you? What gates are important during an investigation, and then we'll go around again.
Yeah, sure. Um, this is the kind of like a long piece, right? So previously, being that we were just two-man team, a lot of it we would focus more on. So let's just start with commodity malware. Commodity malware would occur, and we kind of had a general idea of how it occurred, how it happened, and a little bit more information and context around, the different campaigns that are happening out there in the wild, either through people blogging about it, people posting about it, tweeting about it. So we had that kind of context, and that would be kind of a lower prioritized item for us to investigate, being it was more consistent and constant, and we already investigated it enough, and we had enough information where we didn't have to keep going after it. So team of two. The higher priority items would be more of a targeted campaign, and we would then focus and drill those ones to the ground and look for everything related to it, how they got our information. So it's full scope at that point. I mean, we would look at overall organization attack surface on the internet, whether we were going completely out to kind of like perform open source intelligence to also identify additional ways that our information was out there, down to what else occurred, right? So down to an endpoint, what happened post exploitation, where did it go, what else happened, did anybody else get hit by it, and then of course drafting at the end, of course, drafting lessons learned and a nice report to kind of highlight for next time. But it was really tricky because a lot of the time would be built into investigating it, and it would take a day or two, maybe even longer, right, depending on how long it is, or if an active actor is working in the environment. So it's definitely a lot of it's built around the context of the event. You want to know how it happened, when, and our focus was more strictly on the targeted because the commodity was a little quicker for us to identify and ring up.
So that's a really interesting topic. I might want to go down this rabbit hole for a second here, right? And so, Tim, we've talked about this a number of times in the past, right? So I know, the way that you're structured, whether something is classified as commodity or targeted, and based on a number of criteria, it may go to different parts of the team or different parts of the organization. Can you talk a little bit about that, and kind of how you guys use root cause analysis and those other types of disciplines to make that determination in the first place, and also I think it would be really interesting to just kind of get your take on how effective you think the commodity versus targeted approach is, how realistic it is for organizations.
Yeah, it is a real challenge, because I wouldn't say that it's necessary. I don't think the dichotomy commodity versus targeted is necessarily the right way, though that can work in terms of, as Mike was talking about, whether there's already some kind of level of awareness out there, open source reporting on some type of malware, and if you find malware and nobody knows anything about it, that's certainly an interesting indicator that it might bear further investigation. But it's almost where we're trying to look is how the malware is being wielded and who is using it as to determine whether or not it's targeted. Because just because it's commodity malware doesn't mean that somebody with a targeted attack in mind won't use it. It's commercial off-the-shelf malware. Why would you not use it? Why would you go to the trouble of developing your own if the COTS stuff does work, and also it allows you to blend in with run-of-the-mill ankle biter kind of attacks. But that means that it becomes very difficult to determine who is doing this is probably the hard question to try and answer. So it is a challenge for us, and so it's not an easy determination to make right off the bat. You kind of have to dig in a little bit to see what happened, what the actions were that happened after compromise or exploitation or whatever, or try and piece things together.
Great. No, yeah, that's really interesting, and it is making that determination of commodity versus targeted is hard, right? It's really, really difficult. Bob, so I don't know if you want to weigh in on this. Is that something that you do? As part of do you even deal in a lot of attribution? Do you spend a lot of time up front worrying about where it came from, or are you more focused on behavior, activity, things like that?
Yeah, so weighing in on the commodity versus targeted malware, the way we used to, or the way I feel is most effective in my experience for classifying is not necessarily the name brand of the malware, but kind of like Tim was saying, how it's being used. If spyware that is normally used to just track user activities for advertising purposes has the capability to install a keylogger and take remote control of a system, then that spyware deserves high priority, whether it's being used by a shady ad agency or a nation state actor.
Yeah, there's like a kind of, I don't know, a slogan that I've used, and I don't think I came up with it. I'm sure that someone else mentioned it in my presence once, and I latched onto it. But it's the concept that execution is execution, right? And just because the thing that's executing now isn't harming you doesn't mean that that it's not a really likely vector, and that's not an indicator that something really bad could happen, right?
And as far as attribution, there's a lot of value in attribution, but again, as Tim said, it's a very hard thing to do. It's just a difficult process. And a lot of places, a lot of shops don't have the resources, the cycles to spend time working on attribution. We spend some time doing attribution, especially for cases where the attackers are persistent, and I don't mean that necessarily as advanced persistent threat, but just any case where we have incidents being caused by the same entity multiple times. Because a lot of that goes back to being able to characterize what it is and possibly what their motives are before we even get to the triage phase. If we can identify what it is as it's happening, that helps us a long way in our response.
Yeah, and I want to be clear that I wasn't necessarily going all the way down to attribution in terms of, oh, well, it's Joe Bob sitting over in that country, but maybe just trying to identify if there is a who. Is also a delineator for us. If this is, an automated, clickjack or something like that, that's one kind of decision point. If it has key logging capabilities that, as has been mentioned, that clearly elevates it to a different level, or any kind of remote control, remote access, stuff gets us nervous, and we get spun up about it because that means that there's a person behind it. A botnet scanner that just happens to compromise a poorly configured device is less of a priority, and it wouldn't go to our targeted response team.
No, I appreciate that. That's all. Yeah, I mean, it is. It's nuanced and it's difficult. And a lot of the time, you get to the end of all those types of questions where it's, is it commodity or is it targeted? Or, if you think it is targeted, who is it? You can spend as much or as little time on that as you want. Almost all of the time you get to the end and you're nowhere near 100%, right? So it is. It's definitely difficult. The segue from here into remediation, right? And so this isn't something we're going to spend a ton of time talking about, partly in the interest of time. But it says it right here, right? I mean, everyone does it and everyone does it differently. The most important thing here, as it states, is to have a plan, right? And so, definitely want to spend a good bit of time on feedback. Mike, do you want to say a couple words on remediation?
Yeah, remediation is, you're right. I mean, everyone's going to do it differently, and we've seen where wipe and rebuild is just kind of the standard day-to-day course of action for a lot of our customers, and that's the normal thing. But we've also seen where people will deploy tools. Either standard AV may miss something, and so they will deploy a second or third tool down to the box and attempt to remediate, that way. But everyone does do it differently, and it's just kind of depends upon their appetite for taking on more with time as far as a wipe and rebuild goes, or effort to deploy more tools, right?
Yeah, one thing I'll add here too. Unfortunately, Joe had to drop. He had something come up, somewhat of an emergency. But one of the things that we talk a lot about, both internally and when we're trying to help customers understand the threats that that Joe and his team detect and communicate, is that a lot of this is wholly dependent on your capability, right? So if you back up a few slides to when we're talking about assignment and things like that. A lot of that is very theoretical until you're more than a one-person show, and remediation is very much the same, right? The whole pave and rebuild strategy isn't perfect. It might be a little expensive, but it's probably less expensive than trying to go in and clean it up if you're not 100% certain that you know exactly what happened, because in effect, you're going to clean up some of it, and the threat's actually going to dwell and maybe get worse. So, there's definitely a lot of it does depend on capabilities in a pretty significant way too. And at the same time, remediation also, there's all these different stages. So depending on the type of threat or the behaviors you observe, you have to be pretty careful about that to make sure that you're not doing things out of order. So last thing we'll hit here, right? And we've got a couple questions here that I'll throw at you guys that have come in from the audience. But so talk a little bit about feedback, right? So now our tools have found things, we've correlated those things, we've prioritized them, we've gone through this triage process, we've handed them to an analyst, we've gotten the incidents done, right? Case is closed. This is actually where, at least I think, a lot of the really hard work happens, right? And so, again, Mike, why don't you go ahead and kick us off here? Talk a little bit about, your approach to, what happens after the incident, the importance of it. Just if you want to pick one or two things that you tend to prioritize.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, some of the bigger things would be, you've got all this data from the incident. Related to how it happened, you have your root cause. So we would take this information, generate a decent report out to the business, whether it's certain pieces of software are vulnerable out there in the organization. These are the things that need to be kind of pushed out to be fixed. Those are kind of more the high-level pieces, I guess, in a way, for our improvement, and mixed with the overall reporting of the investigation with, the amount of data we're receiving. We would look at things based on kind of like the product effectiveness. So we would look at the way, the amount of data coming from that, and how many alerts, or how many of these alerts converted to actual investigations for us to go and actually drill into. Obviously, your false positives and your negative rates play a big role. Even here at Red Canary, these are some really big important things. And then severity. How many did you investigate by product for a high severity event, and how many are you responding to daily? Is it effective? And what we would begin to find, let's say at Danaher, is we would have very key core products producing really high valuable alerts, and we would spend more time on those versus some of the lower products providing a ton of alerts but very, very low true positive rates for us to actually investigate. And that's when we would take, so that information right there would help us go back and perform improvement on those products, either building out new use cases or finding new ways to generate some more high fidelity alert out of that data. So we weren't just having a product sitting there that we deployed and it's just decaying.
No, that's good. That's great. Appreciate that insight. And actually, so Joe's back with us, and this is actually this happens to be something that I know is near and dear to him. So, one of the we had a question come in asking, how we first of all, how do you score? Like, so one of the questions that came in is, what scoring methodology do you use, right? Is it based on tools? Is it based on criteria? Is it based on severity? And overall, how do you measure that? And kind of what's your process like for making sure that the effectiveness of your criteria and your process is always improving?
So yeah, so I'm back and I'll chime in. So a couple thoughts on this. So I'll start at the current and work backwards a little bit. So at Red Canary, this is a big thing for us on on working through the events that we're looking at and the data we're looking at. And the approach we take is actually really simple. It's basically we look at each signature or each behavior that we look for, that we present to our analyst, and then we assign a score based on whether it converted to a high, medium, or low notification to our customer, and then take that, and basically multiply it by whether it was a true positive or false positive, and then that gives us an aggregate score, and then we use that to drive prioritization of what gets presented to an analyst. We also use those values, that conversion rate, to drive our internal tuning to determine, okay, hey, we've got something that's potentially causing some alert fatigue. It's not providing the value. It's consuming more time on our analyst aspect than we want to. In previous lives, used very similar ideas, where certain tools and certain alert signatures we gain over time in tracking how often they were converting. And I think Mike mentioned this too, is how often they were converting. We would look at that, and the higher percentage of conversion rate, maybe not the number of events, but looking at it over a percentage base, of conversion rate to something that we could action on, would raise up and would drive that to a more actionable event. And things that weren't converting, we would drive, had that lower rate, we would then prioritize in based on how much time they were consuming, how many events they were generating, and look at opportunities to reduce the noise in that. And then using basically just that simple back and forth of look, how often this was converting and at what level to drive where we're taking opportunities to improve different products. The other thing you do is start with a small piece. Don't try and do it across all your tools. Look at, if you got a particular tool that's, you think should have high value, but it's supremely noisy, we would take that and look at that and and look at where we were expecting value and see if there was opportunities within the environment to tune out some of that noise. So hey, this thing's sending some sort of particular alert, and we can identify the cause of that to a certain couple of systems, a certain couple of users, and identify that and take action to tune and address that, and then feed that back into the system. And the idea is that this is where we close the loop. Is taking this opportunities to tune and identify and get higher and higher fidelity based on what we learned from things that we've already seen. The other piece of it would be looking back and is there anything that we missed or we could have found faster or better, and using that again to drive new detection capabilities. Okay, hey, looking back at this, we do our root cause analysis, and the attacker came in this way, he did these certain things, and we had alerts for half of those behaviors. We caught the whole picture because we had good coverage, but we missed some of these behaviors that are probably interesting in other aspects. So then that would we'd tee those up to put back into the system and say, okay, how do we find this specific behavior next time and find it faster? And then it's continually improving our detection capability and then driving back all the way through the system.
Fantastic, appreciate it.
So I have some thoughts here too, a little bit less specific, but feedback in our little banner at the top comes last. But I would say that feedback is probably one of the first things to work on in developing incident response operations. Like, if there's any one measure of the maturity of your program, I would say it's whether or not you have some sort of feedback loop. It's not whether you have detection of both your endpoint and your network or anything like that, but whether or not you're learning from what you're doing. It helps analysts be faster. It helps analysts be happier because they're not banging their head against the same wall every time. And it also drives the money. So you can demonstrate to management and the people who hold the purse strings the efficacy of what you're doing. So I can't underscore the importance of feedback enough, and it's how only 2 people were able to do what they were able to do at Danaher, which is just ridiculous. I mean, you need 2 magical unicorns to be able to do that, but still, it was all based on the feedback section of things, in my opinion.
That is true. It's cyclical, right? So anybody who comes from an intelligence background in particular is familiar with the intelligence cycle, and there's a reason that it is a circle, and that if you think back to the diagram that kind of we used to frame all this, it is a circle, right? I mean, here across the top it's left to right, but none of these things exist in a vacuum. That's fantastic. We have a few minutes left and a couple of questions, so I thought we'd do we'll do a quick lightning round while we wrap up. So Bob, a question for you, right? So we actually had one come in that said, I'm on a team of 2 security practitioners and remediation takes forever. Any recommendations on how to expedite and how to do that safely? So if you don't mind a few words on that, appreciate it.
Key point there, bring in help from other teams. Get interaction with the IT department, with anyone else on the team who manages services that can help you in your remediation efforts. Goes a long, long way, especially if they are reliable in the way that they handle remediation. That can be a tremendous resource in how you respond and remediate.
Fantastic, appreciate that. Quick, so lightning question for you, Mike. So we have one come in that says, what tools are you guys seeing that are the most reliable or that produce the most reliable alerts?
Perfect question.
Don't just say Red Canary.
The ones with human intelligence behind them. No. That's tricky because everything requires a little bit of tuning for your environment. Nothing out of the box has been producing good fidelity events for a lot of our customers that I've been hearing. Trying to think of a good answer besides.
Well, I mean, I think if I won't put words in your mouth, but I think it is, it's much more about process than it is about tools, right? You can I think just from the five of us on the phone here, right? I mean, we've all are either in now or have come from environments that have like either a lot of tools or no tools, and you can be in an environment with one or two tools, some really good people, and a really great process, and an eye on automation, and you can extract far more value from that than we see financial firms that own one of every tool, right? And they're not leveraging any of them well. It's just you see both sides of that. So, all right, so I apologize, everybody. So we're at time. We have a few more questions we didn't have time to get to, although I appreciate all the questions coming in during the course of the webinar. So that certainly helped to break things up and hopefully provided some valuable insights. Thanks again to all of our panelists. Really appreciate all of your input and all of your thoughts. It's a fantastic conversation, and hopefully we get to do this again soon. Thanks to everyone, all of our participants and guests. Again, appreciate you sending questions in and your participation, and hope that everyone has a great day. There will be a blog post to follow, so anybody that did submit questions that we didn't get to, we'll try to address those there. Thanks again, all. Take care.